Listen to my story about a man named Jim.
Hollywood loves a good tale about the quest for oil.
I drink your milkshake.
But there's one thing they never show. What happens to all of that black gold once it comes gushing out of the ground? Pipelines might not make for exciting plot lines, but it's going to be tough to get rich without a way to get all that newly discovered crude to market. Here's Bloomberg Law's Ellen Gilmer to explain how pipelines work.
Pipelines are kind of an invisible infrastructure. They're moving natural gas and oil and, all of these related products from the ground to where they're processed to where they end up being used.
Most Americans know about pipelines from what they hear about them on TV.
Environmental activists marched in Washington today to protest plans for the Keystone XL oil pipeline.
Native Americans in North Dakota have been protesting over the Dakota Access Pipeline.
But what people might not realize is that in nearly every corner of America, there's probably a pipeline right under their feet. Now, a series of high-profile legal setbacks has some in the industry asking, is it still possible to build pipelines in America?
Oil, the most sought-after commodity of the 20th century.
But how does one harvest and deliver a product so plentiful without transportation?
In the early days, oil was transported by teams of horses. That's where the term teamsters comes from. And you'd have oil in whiskey barrels. That's why we still use the term barrels of oil.
The first primitive oil pipeline is believed to have been constructed in 1862 at Pennsylvania's aptly named Oil Creek Valley. Built out of two wooden boards to make a V shape, the pipe carried crude oil about 1,000 feet from a well to a storage tank. Crude pipes transporting natural gas date back even earlier, as you can see in this illustration from 1821. Over the years, oil and gas pipelines got more sophisticated. As the country grew and its energy needs expanded, pipelines proliferated.
The lines of pipe, alive with racing oil.
Today, more than 2.6 million miles of pipeline form a hidden energy superhighway just below the surface. So, how did pipelines get so contentious? Leaks, spills, and land battles have always created some tensions between pipelines and the communities they traverse. But in the early 2000s, things started to heat up, thanks largely to one word.
Fracking.
Fracking.
The U.S. shale and fracking boom.
Since fracking started in about 2007, we've seen just an unprecedented build-out of oil pipelines and gas pipelines all across the country.
Professor Alexandra Klass teaches and writes about environmental law at the University of Minnesota Law School. She says the fracking boom, followed by a pipeline boom to carry all that new energy, has led to a litigation boom.
So you start to see lots of opposition from private property rights advocates, landowners, and others to this infrastructure.
Backing many of those lawsuits were the country's top environmental groups, who saw shutting down pipelines as key to their fight against climate change. In their view, stop the pipelines, stop the drilling. To understand the strategy these groups have used to challenge pipelines, it helps to know a bit about the permitting process for the two main types, oil and gas. Let's start with oil. The thing about oil pipelines is that while it looks like they are a part of the National Infrastructure Plan, it's actually up to the states to regulate them, and each state has its own rules. For example, in Texas, with its deep ties to the oil industry, it's much easier to secure a pipeline permit than, say, in Illinois or Minnesota.
If you're in Texas, all you need to do is check a box saying you're a common carrier and you get to build your pipeline and use eminent domain. But lots of other states like Illinois and Minnesota require pipelines to get a certificate of need or some sort of permit from a state regulatory agency.
This state-by-state approach creates an obvious problem for pipeline builders.
So if you're building a multi-state oil pipeline, you need approval from multiple states.
Take, for example, a pipeline connecting oil fields in North Dakota with transfer terminals in Illinois. The pipeline would have to travel through North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Illinois. In addition to crossing 3 state lines, it would traverse over or near tribal land, through waterways, and under public and private lands. Each crossing requires separate permits and creates an opportunity for opponents to challenge the project. This is exactly what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. After years of protests and lawsuits over the pipeline's proximity to a reservation, a federal judge ruled that the pipeline shut down pending further environmental review. An appeals court reversed the order, but the threat of a shutdown still looms. And then there's natural gas. Because gas is, well, a gas, unlike oil, it can't easily be shipped in trucks or trains, so pipelines have historically been the only way to move it. Concerned that this ability to control the flow of gas, and therefore the price, gave producers a monopoly, Congress passed the Natural Gas Act of 1938. The federal government has regulated gas pipelines ever since. Today, a natural gas company wanting to build an interstate pipeline doesn't need approval from individual states. Instead, it must get a permit from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC.
That's a huge process in itself. You have to go through an environmental review process. You have to show that the pipeline is actually needed, that it's serving the public. Then you also have to get all of these other kind of miscellaneous permits for impacts that your pipeline might have on the environment, on environmental justice communities, on historical artifacts along the route.
Each of those permits you can think about them as pressure points. To the extent that you extend out the permitting process and the litigation for whether it's an oil pipeline or a natural gas pipeline, that can threaten the viability of the project.
In July of 2020, Dominion and Duke Energy announced their decision to cancel the Atlantic Coast gas pipeline after years of delay and ballooning costs. And, more than a decade after becoming the first cause célèbre of the modern anti-pipeline movement, the Keystone XL oil pipeline still hasn't been built.
In all the different legal challenges to oil and gas pipelines over the past decade, challengers to pipelines have had a lot more success than industry lawyers expected. There were big construction delays with a lot of pipelines because of litigation.
So what's next? Legal setbacks and historically low oil prices have led some in the industry to question whether pipelines still make economic sense. But America still needs to power its homes, cities, and cars, and a clean energy future that relies on solar, wind, and other carbon-free power is likely years off. In the meantime, pipelines will still be built. Just don't expect Hollywood to make a movie about them anytime soon.